You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
It's a classic moment when Wendell Willkie, FDR's opponent in 1940, attacks Hopkins and says that he's a close advisor and he's acting like a president. He's making the decisions. He lives in the White House. He has undue influence. Roosevelt responds in a campaign speech stating, "Well, here's what I think of Harry Hopkins. We had a man who worked for $1 a year in Washington who, with the enemy at our gate, kept this country going. He sleeps in a little room upstairs in the White House, so he can be near to serve me. When he got sick and the doctors ordered to give up and leave, he stayed at his post of duty until I practically ordered him out of Washington." FDR defeats Wendell Willkie. Still talk about Willkie running again, but he's offering FDR his help now in the Lend-Lease program. And FDR's like, "Why don't you talk to Harry?" And he says, "I don't want to talk to Harry Hopkins. I don't want to talk to that man because he had such a bad image." And FDR says, "You know, Wendell, one day you may get to this office, and I'll tell you this. You're going to find that a man who's here to simply serve your interests is something you're really going to need." One character in a novel tells the other, "If we would convince and convert, we must veil our thought and curb our enthusiasm, so that those we would influence will think us reasonable." These words were written in a novel given to Woodrow Wilson, one that he enjoyed reading and one that he took to heart. What he didn't know is that the person that gave it to him, his aide, Colonel Edward House, had written the novel. The novel, Philip Drew Administrator, told the story of an idealistic West Point graduate who leads an armed revolt against the reactionary government in Washington for the good of social progress. In it, Drew sails off to Europe with his sweetheart to organize a League of Nations after his presidency that will ensure world peace for everyone. "I am sending you the book of which I spoke. It was written by a man I know. My friend, whose name is not to be mentioned, told me that Philip was all that he himself would like to be, but was not." This is what Edward House says to Wilson as he's giving him the book. You see in several accounts of people who helped select Woodrow Wilson for the presidency in 1912 that all of a sudden, it's time to govern, there appeared this man from Texas, a thin man of enormous wealth, always seemed to be getting the president's ear, who Wilson was mentioning, "My dear friend House." Wilson campaign manager William McCombs recalled that the Texan was around headquarters every afternoon, trying to meet everybody, but he had no official title in the organization, but his intimate friendship with the candidate, and that gave him wide-ranging authority. One afternoon, McCombs came to the governor for a private conversation, only to find House and Wilson seated side by side. Instead of leaving the room to allow McCombs to speak confidentially with the candidate, House sat silently in a bowed position, his hands across his chest. But Colonel Hedwin House had befriended Wilson just as he was rising in his name as a potential candidate for the presidency. He was heavily involved in politics. He was a Democrat, he was a progressive, and he was rich. As a young man, he had inherited a fortune from his father. And he used it in politics. He's the one who connects William Jennings Bryan and Wilson. Wilson one day, in talking to House, says, "Oh, I'd really like to meet him sometime." And the next time they meet, he points to a fireplace, and there is William Jennings Bryan waiting. He's well known for supporting a populist governor of Texas, Hogg, who wins in a surprise after large amounts of money and employed men start filtering throughout the state of Texas in support for this candidate. He gets a name, especially in Texas politics, but wants to move out of the state. When he hears about Wilson, he likes the idea and pledges his loyalty, but more than that, his friendship. Your unselfish friendship has meant much to me, Wilson would write in letters. I've tried all my life to find somebody I could support. I hated to leave you last night. I feel like we have known each other all our lives. These sound like love letters, but these are letters between Wilson and Colonel Edwin House. He was never really a military commander. He got that title from the governor of Texas. In between election and inauguration, Colonel Edwin House became inseparable with President Wilson. He'd have him over to his Manhattan apartment. He'd cook eggs for him. I will never argue with the president when we disagree, House admitted. Whenever Wilson came to him for suggestions on drafts of speeches, it was the colonel's policy to nearly always praise it at first, in order to strengthen the president's confidence in himself, which, strangely, is always lacking. Wilson asked if he would like some position in the cabinet, but House said no, I'd rather not. Indeed, House never took any official position or salary, rarely recommended people for office unless Wilson asked him whether something was a good idea or not. His role in the presidency consisted solely of one-on-one conversations with Woodrow Wilson. Wilson would end up appointing an opponent of Colonel Edwin House, Albert Burleson, for the Postmaster General, the plum job in a presidential administration because of the number of jobs. Wilson was a kind of a cold fish. I mean, he wasn't a guy you just went up and talked to, and he didn't always have a lot of visitors. And this has been a constant criticism of Woodrow Wilson. And however, it got to be known if you wanted to get to Wilson, you should schedule a meeting with Colonel Edward House. The president, it lacks executive ability, House would say. The little things get to him. He would help him with that. He would handle difficult matters, anything that was a conflict. He ran the 1916 re-election effort, put much more into it than Wilson did. In the fall of 1915, House proposed to the president that he call a humanitarian peace conference and summon all the belligerents. With the nations of the world assembled, Wilson would advance an American peace proposal, while preparing to back up its terms with military force. All nations who accepted the U.S. plan would receive the support of American arms against any nations who dared reject it. Even the colonel's admiring biographers have trouble explaining the document, essentially committing to war without a moment's consultation with Congress. Much to House's chagrin, his plan fell through because the British rejected it. They disliked the idea of a peace conference that would limit them. He was for the Allies during the conflict in World War I, but he hid it. He hid how much he was for the Allies so that he could be a neutral player with Wilson. He's the one that would go out to Europe and go out to Britain on several meetings trying to negotiate a peaceful solution. If we could only deal with House, Lord Balfour of the foreign minister in Britain said. And this was where House fails, because Wilson starts getting wind that people are making fun of him, that people in Europe are kind of laughing behind his back because House is doing all of the work. Edith Wilson, his second wife, also gets in the way. It seems impossible, she tells Wilson, for two people to always think alike, casting doubt on maybe this guy's just sort of snowing you a bit. But when there's articles that show that Wilson, that show that House is the real brains of the Peace Commission, Wilson started going alone to meetings. And something that's pretty close to our own time is that you do see this secret advisor for Woodrow Wilson start to get questioned in the press, both by opponents within the Democratic Party of Woodrow Wilson and the GOP. Particularly when Edward House becomes not just an advisor in the background, but actually starts engaging in diplomatic missions. Here's the New York Tribune. The Sphinx of Politics. It was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone that made possible the unraveling of the secrets of the Egyptian pyramids and the monuments. the practice is common of referring to Colonel Edward Mandell House, President Wilson's later ego, as the Sphinx of American politics. From the silent lips of the man from Texas has come no hint by which the American public could judge this man, who obviously plays so important a role in the affairs of the nation. Now, it's going to talk about the Rosetta Stone that it has found, but it attacks House on a couple of things that people have been circulating about him. One is that House was claiming to be a businessman, a Texas businessman. Sounds really good, right? Except that in reality, House had inherited his fortune from his father at a very young age and really engaged in very little real business, so to speak. His business was making governors of Texas, shopping around for a progressive candidate that he could find that lead the nation. Now, progressive means a little different than what it might mean today, but certainly he was what you might call like a Western progressive, like a Bryanite. But he started to see that Bryan wasn't winning. He goes for Mayor Gaynor of New York City, a reformed Democrat, but just can't get it together with him and finds him difficult to work with, and goes through a few others. He's looking at Oscar Underwood, the senator from Alabama, and then settles on Woodrow Wilson. The article goes through this. So you have this kind of mysterious figure. There's a lot of questions about him. Why is so much being handed to him? And then they find the Rosetta Stone. Now another Rosetta Stone has been found, and the mute tongue of the Sphinx is loosened because of a stone written by a book he wrote himself, in which it is revealed that millionaire and hard man of business as he is supposed to be, he is basically a dreamer with ideas of reforming the entire social and political status of America and the world. What they've found is that novel, Philip Drew, Administrator. And not only does the New York Tribune expose it, but it's exposed on the floor of Congress by a GOP congressman who's mad at Wilson and at House. And he exposes that this Philip Drew novel, written in 1912, is actually written by House. And in it, it shows a Westerner that's going to take on the plutocracy. We're all plutocrats in the east of the country, he says. He's going to change the social system, that he's going to tax the rich and he's going to, give it to the poor and all sorts of things like this. The question is raised again and again. Who elected him? It really, considering their close friendship, comes to a very bitter end. In 1921, Colonel House visits Washington, where the Wilsons had settled after Warren Harding was elected, and decided to call on Wilson to try to work out their differences. He went to the house on S Street, handed his card to the butler, and waited in the parlor. Within a few minutes, the servant returned with the news that the crippled former president, who seldom left the premises, was officially not in. Wilson refused to answer any of the subsequent written communications, even when those letters began to pierce the shield that had been set up by Edith Wilson. "Don't mention House to me anymore," he said to one of his friends, who urged him to write to the colonel. "That door is closed." There is a funny case where a person was of great assistance to a president, but they didn't stand next to that president. In fact, the president was in Washington and he was in New York, and nobody found out about his assistance until 35 years later. And that was the case with Daniel Rawlins. When Chester Arthur became president, everybody was anxiously awaiting what his annual message, his first one, would be to Congress, because it wasn't a person that had been greatly exposed to national office. He was the port collector of New York, well known to be a patronage job. He was known to be part of the New York Republican political machine. He was an ally of Roscoe Conkling. He was a kind of, in the perception of the American people, not an independent actor, but a jobs for sale guy, a party boss. A nice guy. People liked him, charming, but a boss, nonetheless. So what's he going to say in his address? And when Garfield dies in September 1881, Arthur is elevated to the presidency because he had been put on there just as a way of mending fences between the two main Republican tickets. Chat Arthur, President of the United States. Good God. When the House read the president's words on December 6th, members of Congress listened with an air of interest. See, his speech would be read out. Presidents didn't go before Congress at this time, so Chester Arthur didn't need to make an appearance to Congress. He would send a paper that would be read by the clerk of the House. Many of them expected that this wasn't going to be great. What did Arthur know? An appalling calamity has befallen the American people since their chosen representatives. But what's delivered is a very long message. We might else recall with forceful language, the rare prosperity, well-versed on topics under discussion at that time, have been plenteous. Its varied industries have... The entire nation seems to breathe a sigh of relief. And the headline of the New York Times says, "The President's Message, an able review of national concerns." Harper's Weekly says, "The message has impressed the country very favorably and has won for Arthur a regard and confidence which we trust will be retained throughout his administration." Forces on the Canadian frontier has allayed apprehension. The acting Attorney General also calls his attention to the disturbance of the public tranquility during the past years in the territory of Arizona. A band of armed desperados known as cowboys, probably numbering from 50 to 100 men, have been engaged for months in committing acts of lawlessness and brutality, which the local authorities have been unable to... But here's the thing about the president's message. He didn't write a word. It was written by a 35-year-old Yale graduate and a lawyer in New York named Daniel G. Rawlins. Measures for promoting the efficiency of the Army without adding to the number of its officers, and recommends the legislation necessary to increase the number of enlisted men to 30,000, the maximum allowed by law. I concur with his recommendations. And he became, unknown to anyone, a secret advisor to the president. The Indian should receive the protection of law. He should be allowed to maintain in court his rights of person and property. Although our system of government does not contemplate that the nation should provide or support a system of the education of our people, no measures calculated to promote that general intelligence has ever been regarded with indifference by Congress or the executive. But unlike almost everyone else we're going to talk about in this episode, Daniel Rawlins never actually took an office in Washington, D.C. In fact, he had a position in New York State and wasn't going to give that up. The government should aid the work of education. The two met in New York Civil War Society. Rawlins was compared to a banty rooster with a sharp Roman nose, curly black hair, and a bushy mustache, so writes Michael Medev. He naturally traveled in New York's most elite circles, including the fashionable Union League Club, and another member of that club was Chet Arthur, the tall, portly, side-whiskered gentleman boss of the New York Customs House. He and Rawlins shared a strong tie as loyal sons of the same fraternity. Rawlins and two other people are with Arthur on the night of September 19th, when a messenger boy arrives at 11:30 with news of President Garfield's death. And what does Chester Arthur do? Does he say, I'm ready to take the reins of the presidency? No. He delays 2 months before he moves into the White House. He didn't know anyone in Washington, so it was inevitable that he would turn to his old friend in New York for aid. This from Gentleman Boss Thomas C. Reeves. A man well placed in the administration said of the president, he is a sensitive, almost timid man, with reference to his responsibilities. He's also a moody man. At dinners, he is his best, and chats with the men over cigars with a zest that makes us feel he is kind of a boy. But when you go to his office in the morning, there you see a man oppressed with either duties or inversion of his natural hours, or staggering under a sense of responsibility, which he does not like. As collector, he could delegate most of his duties to subordinates, but in the presidency, he cannot delegate much. Beyond the social obligations of the presidency, Arthur usually found the duties distasteful. He arrived at his office late and received congressmen till noon. On Tuesdays and Fridays, cabinet meetings were held till 12 p.m. On Wednesdays, the president greeted the public for an hour. After lunch, he remained in his office till about 4 or 5 o'clock, seeing callers by appointment. From 5 to 7:30, he read, rested, or rode horseback, and then dressed for dinner. Sundays and Mondays he reserved for himself. Rollins, supplied with reports and recommendations from cabinet members, began working on a speech weeks in advance in an atmosphere of total secrecy. In a letter from New York on November 12th, "Please tell me how I can address you, sir, so that the letter will be truly opened by nobody but yourself." It's not till 1925, when C.M. Henley, one of the second-level White House secretaries, reveals in an interview that Rollins is the one who writes Arthur's first congressional message in 1881, and actually all of his annual messages. There sits today in this White House, closer to the president, separated only by a swinging door, a man that no other president has ever had as a confidential advisor. When Calvin Coolidge took over after Warren Harding's death, he was going to keep most of Harding's people, but he had one position to appoint on his own, a secretary. And since he already had a perfectly nice vice presidential secretary, people figured that would be the person that would now head to the White House. But instead, the announcement that came over radio receivers in Washington, D.C., Coolidge would pick C. Bascom Slump to the post. What? Slump? He had been all but kicked out of Congress. If those accusations flying around the Capitol coffee shops and in the press were right, Slump could be bought and sold. But something else. Coolidge is taking over, trying to show that the GOP party should not be associated with the Teapot Dome scandal that had really afflicted the Harding administration. In fact, Harding's own death perhaps saves him from a larger investigation of his role and his knowledge of the scandal. Is it really the time for somebody like Slump to be in the position? And if that wasn't enough, there's something else. Slump is a Virginia congressman, a rare GOP in the South in the 1920s. But unlike some of his fellow GOP members like Leonidas Dyer over in Missouri, who was putting out anti-lynching bills, Slump was voting against that. This drew protests from the NAACP because Slump is associated with what's called the Lily White movement, which is to replace African-American appointed federal office holders in the South and to create a more, frankly, white GOP party in the South to appeal in general elections. In one African-American newspaper, there's even rumors. Slump is a member of the Klan. Why on earth would Coolidge want to have any association with this person? Well, maybe it was his notebook. That little black book with names and numbers and notes of everything that made Washington go. Small details. Maybe it was the charm that Slump would use with his Virginia ham lunches, plying reluctant congressmen, his ability to work reporters. Maybe there was something in Coolidge about, he might be a son of a you-know-what, but he's our son of a you-know-what. To more astute observers, it looked like Calvin Coolidge wasn't just going to be a president who took over after a deceased president. He wanted to be a winner. He wanted the nomination. He wanted a chance at the next election. Isn't this a given? Right? Someone takes over after the death of the president, then they're going to run. Like Lyndon Johnson or Truman. Not at this time. The only other person that had done it was Theodore Roosevelt, who ran in 1904. And what should be obvious about that is Coolidge isn't Theodore Roosevelt. And you don't just get to do something just because he set the precedent, but Coolidge was aiming to make this happen. Baskin Slemp could give him the nomination because in those days, this has to be understood, GOP nominations came from the South. This is odd because in the 1920s, if you're going to look at any political map from after the Civil War to the time we're talking about, you're going to see in the presidential elections that the Democrats always win these states. These are one-party states. But because of that fact, all of the federal appointees went not to elected people, generally, because there weren't many elected GOP in the South, but to appointments. And generally, this is where African-American delegates in the South would receive postmasterships or other things, other offices, and then would go to the convention and be loyal and vote for the president was running. Where we really see this is when there's a challenge, when Theodore Roosevelt challenges President Taft in the Republican convention, and it's the South that keeps Taft with the nomination, even though the GOP party didn't have a chance of winning one of those southern states at that time. Same thing happening here. You want the nomination, you go south. Slemp controlled GOP Virginia, a state that hadn't voted Republican in some time, but did vote for his Little Mountain District, which was held previously by his father. Now, Slemp, as we said, had just been in a scandal. In 1921, it was in the Congressional Record. It was revealed that he was selling jobs. In fact, they produced receipts, $100 checks made out to Slemp from various office holders. Slemp retired a few months later. Coolidge knew about Slemp and had one requirement. No memos when you're talking to me. Get that notebook away in our meetings. And don't write any memoir. It sucks for history, because that would be cool. But he did comply with this wish. Pretty soon, Slemp ran things with an iron hand. It began to be seen that don't see Coolidge, reporters said. See Bascom Slemp. S-E-E. See Bascom Slemp. Coolidge wouldn't say anything to you. The president works like a champ, Slemp would say, even though Slemp was doing most of the paperwork. He destroyed the progressive competition for the nomination, namely Hiram Johnson of California, with some old card sharping, took states that Johnson was relying on, including South Dakota, where presidential patronage was amply used to get the state to go for Coolidge. This leads to a lot of outrage, and there's still a lot of talk about his corruption. There's still a lot of talk about his potential Klan connections. Here's Robert La Follette. There sits today in this White House, closer to the president, separated only by a swinging door, a man that no other president has ever had as a confidential advisor. Indeed, he'd provide one more service to Coolidge. He'd testify in the Teapot Dome Committee. He thought maybe Coolidge would invoke executive ability, but as we'll see a pattern, Coolidge was happy to receive help from Slemp, but didn't give him too much. Slemp goes to the committee. Lawrence Walsh is the presiding officer there. They fire questions at Slemp because they believe he's involved in Teapot Dome. This is a scandal where oil reserves for the Navy in Wyoming were sold to rich oil businessmen who have been donors to the Republican Party and presumably had Harding's knowledge. And other people were very involved. This scandal was ongoing in investigations really throughout the 20s. Democrats thought that Slemp knew more about Teapot Dome than he was letting on, and the committee led by Senator Walsh wanted to talk to him. They had a bit of evidence, which could be written off as circumstance, but sometimes given who it was, well, Bascom had traveled to Florida and talked to a key witness a few days before the man met with Senate investigators. It was a coincidence, but one that could generate suspicion. So they call him into the investigating committee. Slump hopes that Coolidge perhaps is going to, waive executive privilege on his behalf. That doesn't happen. Coolidge was happy to work with Slump, maybe even appreciated his work ethic, which matched his own. In fact, Slump appears at the committee, and claims he's sick. He hadn't gotten much rest, and he has his physician with him. This hearing room is loaded with reporters. Everybody thinks they've got him. It's going to echo in the future another person we're going to talk about, Bob Haldeman. Walsh bangs the gavel. Slump sits down in his chair. But Slump is able to sort of regale them with tales. Like when they ask about various details of Florida, he'll say, well, that must have been during my fishing trip. As I remember, we caught quite a bit of trout. He sort of gave the impression of innocence. And the senators really couldn't get any new information from him. He kept talking. He never took the fifth or anything. But they couldn't get any new details or information from him. The committee dismisses Slump in frustration. And the press pretty much announces that not only Slump, but Coolidge have been cleared. The secretary had certain innovations, including in-depth presidential briefings. Since there were gaps in Coolidge's background, Slump, he had been a vice president who just came in from being a state senator and being governor for not that long. Slump brought in experts from around the country and had discussions with each national issue that was facing the country in Coolidge's presence. Now, maybe it didn't work too much, but he also arranges for the first radio broadcast of a State of the Union address. Something happens. Coolidge has a knack for radio, and the president's crisp Vermont twang makes a good impression. Slump does everything he can to publicize it. He's working reporters all the time. He's giving them little bits of information they may need if they'll help out his patron, Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge now has the nominations running for president against John W. Davis. John W. Davis uses the Klan issue and says, you doing nothing, President Coolidge, to speak out against the Klan. Slump merely releases a statement, a note, signed by C. Bascom Slump. The president is not in sympathy with the aim and purpose of the Ku Kluxers. No statement comes from Coolidge, so that enemies of the Klan are joyous over this statement from the president. Those who are more inclined to support the secret organization say, well, it only came from Slump. It turned out to be just enough to skirt the issue in the election. After Coolidge is reelected, Slump would have liked a chairmanship of the Republican Party, thank you very much, but it was not to be. He will help Hoover get his nomination. He'll get a small job out of that. Theodore Roosevelt was hiking in the redwoods in great admiration of the sprawling height and cathedral-like atmosphere in the forest around him. 3,000-ton trees. But one thing annoyed him. Signs naming the trees. Names like Old Fremont, Big Pete, Uncle John. And so he told the caretakers, all of us desire to see nature preserved. Above all, the trees should not be marred by placing placards on them. Those who do so, Roosevelt said, should be sternly discouraged. They gave, he said, an air of ridicule to the trees. And after his speech, he then went into the forest. That gave his secretary, William Loeb, enough time to scramble. And he gathered some local folks around where the president had been speaking. Quick, let's remove some of the signs. When TR came out of the forest, the annoyances were largely gone. He was amazed and surprised by the community's spirit, and posed for a picture next to a tree, his spirits raised, and then warned them Californians might have to fight to defend them from timber jackals, and it would be their patriotic duty to conserve the forest. This sign cleanup was just the type of efficiency that Presidential Secretary William Loeb offered his boss. On any travel, Loeb would run the Elysian. That was the train car, the rolling White House, that would allow TR to use his trademark energy on trips throughout the United States, while still maintaining important business, most of which Loeb would handle. On such trips, Loeb played an essential role, but it was in Colorado on one trip where Loeb probably played the most important role, possibly saving Theodore Roosevelt's life. When I was governor of New York, Theodore Roosevelt would tell people, I didn't want to stop working at 5 o'clock. And there was only one secretary who was there in the building when I had ideas. And that was William Loeb. Theodore Roosevelt spoke quickly. And there's one point when he first gets made governor of New York, a position he wouldn't serve that long in because he'd be promoted to vice president, if you want to call it that. And he goes out to the room of secretaries and says, get me someone who can take my stenography. And there's a group of them looking at each other. And finally, they realize William Loeb's going to be the one that walks in. And for 4 hours, Theodore Roosevelt is giving him the dictation to take down. And he takes it all down. The other secretaries in the office are amazed when he comes out and unfazed whatsoever. Such began a partnership and even a friendship between these two people. Theodore Roosevelt started to ask him for not just stenography, but advice, and made him a governor's aide rather than just a secretary, coming out of his own pocket. Loeb, a kind of pudgy guy, doesn't have Theodore Roosevelt's physique, but this became interesting because he started to mimic Theodore Roosevelt. He'd wear the same glasses that that he wears, have his mustache in the same way, cut his hair in the same way, and wear the same clothes. That's probably pretty kind of weird, like a whole single white female type thing going on. But TR didn't mind. Little flattery didn't hurt. And he knew it was coming from a good place. Indeed, when he becomes vice president, Loeb becomes the VP stenographer, the only office he was able to hire. Then when McKinley is shot, Loeb follows Theodore Roosevelt into the White House, but does not become the key chief secretary. And that's because George Courtleigh was already there, and Courtleigh was McKinley's secretary, also had a great reputation, who also had Theodore Roosevelt's confidence. He was a human machine who ran the office, read 400,000 pieces of mail for McKinley, gave him the summary of things, told him what was important and what was not. The right-hand man. He even managed the press, Courtleigh did. All the gossip. In fact, when McKinley's assassinated, everyone goes to Courtleigh to say what to do. Just a little bit about him. I know it's a little bit of a divergence from Loeb. Every morning, when McKinley sat down at his desk, he found a neat, typewritten sheet headed "The President's Engagement" set out in front of him. This gave him the complete minute-by-minute program for the day. Besides the name of each visitor to be seen or every piece of business to be transacted, Courtleigh provided confidential notes to guide the president. Said the Independent magazine, in all we have known about Courtleigh, we had never known him to blunder over anything. So when Loeb takes office, Loeb becomes the assistant secretary. Courtleigh is definitely going to be the top guy. Roosevelt trusts him too. This actually gives Loeb an opportunity because while Courtleigh is doing all the kind of presidential managing day to day and some of the press managing day to day, Loeb manages the politics. He's meeting with party chairs. He's setting up what will become the possible Roosevelt run for re-election. So you got to remember, when Roosevelt takes over from McKinley, that was based on McKinley's death. Nobody trusted Roosevelt in the beginning. Nobody knew if he was going to run. He had a big opponent in Mark Hanna of Ohio. In fact, it's only Hannah's death that ends that potential challenge. Here's from Michael Medved's excellent The Shadow Presidents, The Secret History of the Chief Executives and Their Top Aides. And it's one of these things like, you know, people say, like, my history computer for politics. Well, things are so crazy now. How can you learn anything from history? And then I walk into a library and see a book like this, The Shadow Presidents, The Secret History of the Chief Executives and Their Top Aides, because these presidential aides are in the news again. And what's important in the story of Adams and the other people we're going to talk about is that, you know, just like anyone can become president if they're a citizen, if they've lived here long enough, if they're of age, and if they didn't serve 2 terms as president. Anyone can become president. The way things are structured and have been structured over history is that presidents can bring with them a variety of people, and they can choose at times to listen to the official positions that Congress knows about, that the government always has, or they can bring in other advisors and listen to them more. With Loeb and Courtlew working side by side in the White House, Roosevelt enjoyed the services of a powerhouse staff that would have been the envy of any executive. The slick teamwork of the 2 secretaries contributed measurably to Roosevelt's success in his first years as president. But it was only a matter of time before Loeb got tired of the secondary role. So he came up with a suggestion: name Courtlew to a cabinet position, and then he could take over. He became Secretary of Commerce and Labor in 1903. Something else happened in the White House. Loeb not only dresses like Theodore Roosevelt, but even though it wasn't his normal personality, adopts his mannerism. Here's what Medvedev says. Adjoining Loeb's office on the other side was a large executive workroom where a quiet army of clerks and stenographers toiled away at all hours. And now and again, one of these drones popped into the main office to seek Loeb's instructions. The secretary to the president wasted little time, snapping out his orders with an air of impatient authority. This plump, broad-shouldered little man, in gentlemanly clothes, always seemed a bit too large for him, projected a sense of command so unmistakable that one reporter observed, you could tell at a glance he was the king of secretaries. Throughout his kingdom, the monarch insisted on spare and businesslike surroundings. No longer did colorful portraits of previous presidential secretaries decorate the halls. Of central importance on his desktop was the telephone, still relatively new. During Roosevelt's administration, phone service remained primitive and unreliable, and extension lines had not been invented. One central receiver served the entire executive mansion, and it is significant that it was placed on Loeb's desk. The secretary received all incoming calls and summarized their contents for the president. If return calls were necessary, he placed them on the president's behalf, so that Roosevelt did not have to speak on the telephone, which he never did. In day-to-day dealings with visitors, it was the same thing. He was so protective of Theodore Roosevelt's time that they started calling him Stonewall Loeb. One afternoon, a New York publishing executive comes to see the president about a hitch in the postal service that affected his business. Within 2 minutes, Loeb had grasped the situation and announced, "It won't be necessary to see the president." Before he could raise an objective, Loeb had reached for the phone and rung one of the top officials in the post office department. With a curt, 10-word order, he solved the problem at hand, and then hung up the receiver and rose to show his guest to the door. The visiting publisher could hardly believe it. I think the biggest contribution that he makes to politics is having set up some of the important meetings and political meetings that's going to make it easier for Roosevelt to run for re-election, which not all Republicans wanted at the time. But there's this key moment where Roosevelt's a little undecided, hasn't made a statement. There are some people saying, let's draft TR for a second term in 1904. There's others that are arguing against it. And Roosevelt's not making any statements. And Loeb quietly confronts Roosevelt, closes the door and says, "Sir, the time is now. You must either accept or decline." That kind of moment of sitting the man down, is something that's quite talked about among political aides, and it happens apparently, with Roosevelt in this moment. We referenced earlier about a trip that Theodore Roosevelt took where perhaps Loeb saved his life. And Loeb was running the mobile White House, the Elysian train, near Glenwood Springs, Colorado. And this was while there were negotiations going on. Theodore Roosevelt was placed in charge of negotiating the end between the Russo-Japanese War, the war between Russia and Japan in 1905. This was a pretty big deal for a president to be doing this. But there was a pause in the negotiations, and Roosevelt took a break to go bear hunting. When he was out there, a message comes in from War Secretary Taft, who was dealing with the Japanese government on a matter. Loeb receives the telegram and feels that the message was urgent enough that Roosevelt needs to see it right now, and private enough that no one else but he should be the one to deliver it. The problem was Roosevelt was up in the mountains hunting bear. In fact, according to biographer Edmund Morris, he had just shot one that was as big as Secretary Taft. Morris is a clever writer. Loeb takes the train to Newcastle, Colorado, in the Rockies, then hires a Mustang, a horse, as well as a person to help him with it, and goes up the mountain. And he gets there, he hands TR the telegraph as presented. Loeb wasn't just a simple dictation taker, and he knew enough about the message to know that Taft probably hadn't followed Theodore Roosevelt's instructions to a T and probably wouldn't delight his boss. He was right. But he notices, as Theodore Roosevelt is reading Taft's message, he first freezes up. Okay, he's just kind of concentrating. It's taking an awful long time, and he's not reacting. Another minute, and Loeb knows something's up. Well, I think we'll respond to this tomorrow. And they turn in, and Loeb is staying in the same cabin as the president. Roosevelt decides to have no dinner, which is odd for him, having an appetite. He was skipping lunches as part of a diet program, but having no dinner, not very much like the president. And he's staying in the cabin at night, and somewhere around midnight, he's awoken by footsteps. Footsteps that are clearly in the snow. Loeb looks out the window, sees a figure with a dog. Loeb goes out, only to see Theodore Roosevelt in his pajamas. Finally, Roosevelt says, Billy, is that you? And Loeb makes sure that Roosevelt gets in. He had been walking around, delirious, it appeared, in his pajamas. And Roosevelt had a bit of the Cuban fever, malaria, whatever the actual condition was. And so in this instance, it appears Loeb might have saved his life. It didn't stop Roosevelt from responding the next day to Taft that he was completely erroneous in following his instructions in the Japanese negotiations. There's not too much more to say about Loeb. He's going to become, in the future, a very wealthy man on the stock market after Roosevelt's death. He's a person who some say could have repaired the breach between William Howard Taft and Roosevelt because he was on good terms with both of them, but more loyal to TR. In fact, Taft makes him the port collector of New York, which is the biggest patronage position in federal politics at this time. So he's pretty important. And when the breach happens between Roosevelt and he's summoned and, he offers to Taft that perhaps he can work out something, but according to his account, Taft doesn't utilize him. But yet there's another important contribution that Loeb consistently made. Whenever reporters came during Roosevelt's presidency, and for instance, when there's a scandal that occurs because Roosevelt requests $60,000, including money for stables from the Congress, and this is seen as a big sum. Americans don't have stables. Why should we pay for the president's stables? Loeb simply says, that wasn't the president. I made that request. Constantly, in story after story, he tells the press, that's on me. Go ahead and blame it on me, boys. That's on me. That was Loeb's decision. And he's constantly in the newspapers for this reason, making a mistake here, a mistake there, especially in comparison to the previous Secretary of McKinley Courtly, who had this image that nothing was ever handled wrong.
I respect him because of his personal and official integrity. I need him.
During Eisenhower's presidency, there was a meeting between two Democrats, and they were concerned about Eisenhower's health. What would happen if something happened to Eisenhower and Dick Nixon became president? And the other one retorted, that's not what we ought to worry about. What we got to worry about is if something happened to Sherman Adams and Eisenhower became president. In an administration that had a complicated army-like org chart, Sherman Adams was right below Ike. He was a member of that prominent political family, though not the line that John Adams, Samuel Adams comes from, but from a more distant line of the Adams family. Nonetheless, the former governor of Massachusetts became so influential in this administration that unless a proposal had those initials, OKSA, the great machinery was not going to move. And the crazy thing is, Sherman Adams, Ike just meets him in 1952 as he's starting to run his campaign, but immediately likes him, trusts him, and has him run that campaign. He gets him out of trouble a couple of times, navigates dealing with McCarthy, which would have been trouble for Eisenhower in that 52 election, navigates the situation with Nixon because Dick Nixon, the intended VP candidate, gets into a bit of a financial scandal over some payments that he received. And it's Sherman Adams, along with Nixon's performance on television, that helps to navigate that situation. Eisenhower needs Adams when he gets to the White House because he had set up a very high-up presidency. Frankly, it was so that he would lay out strategy and orders, and others would execute. Eisenhower had a rule, for instance. He'd give subordinates one try. You bring me a decision that's really yours, I'm going to note that you did it. You do it a second time, I'm going to look for your replacement. Not surprisingly, going to Sherman was preferable than going to Eisenhower with some type of question. Now, that doesn't mean that Sherman was this warm and friendly guy. In fact, quite the opposite. He was known to be crabby. He was known to have a temper. Secretaries would run out of the office saying, this man's insane. Famous incident happens because the workers in the White House would get so flustered working for him that when he went off on an errand or something, they would all relax, sit on the chairs in a different way. Maybe, you had employees kicking off their shoes and things like that. And there's one moment where Eisenhower comes in and they're all like, oh my God, we're caught. And Eisenhower just looks at them and says, don't worry, I won't tell Governor Adams. Adams functioned as a kind of palace guard, and now we get attacked in the newspapers. He was in every meeting, every cabinet meeting. His comments were listened to. Cabinet officials would go to him first with a lot of matters. He would have twice weekly meetings with all of the White House staff, and that was 412 employees, laying down the law, no leaks, watch the use of cars, watch the blending of political activities and White House activities. But he never took the front office. I work in the kitchen, he would always say. He'd recommend all appointments. When Ike had an heart attack, he was largely managing the White House. Hence the comments of those two Democratic operatives. Yes, Vice President Nixon would chair the meetings, but Adams was running the show. He did sometimes speak during midterm campaigns, during political campaigns. He'd call the Democratic Party a bunch of addle-brained donkeys, intending to go on spending sprees that we're preventing here. Here's from Michael Medved. Here's what Adams said. During the campaign and later in the White House, Eisenhower never defined or outlined the precise duties and responsibilities he wanted me to assume. Evidently, I was supposed to know what I was supposed to do. Sometimes in taking a line of action on my own, I may have overstepped or fallen short of what he had in mind, but I did not hesitate, nor did I ever feeling confused. During the 6 years that he served in the administration, writes Michael Medved, Adams reviewed some 15,000 executive appointments. In nearly all cases, his recommendation amounted to final approval. His negative verdict carried similar authority. When politicos complained to him that he was hurting the party, nuts, Adams would say, we're doing quite enough for the goddamn Republican Party. During the campaign for re-election in 1956, the governor fielded all major problems as they arose, including a bitter dispute concerning the renomination of Vice President Nixon. Harold Stassen, the former governor of Minnesota, who had served the administration as Director for Mutual Security, led a public drive to dump Nixon from the ticket and replace him with Massachusetts Governor Christian Herter. Adams decided to save the administration embarrassment by pressuring Herter to renounce the movement. Now, how did he get to do that? Adams says, in making future plans, I could take into account the fact that he would be given a favorable consideration for a position of responsibility in the State Department. And he also hinted, Eisenhower would have no objection if you were to go before the convention and nominate Nixon. That's exactly what happened. And indeed, a few months later, he became Undersecretary of State. Sherman Adams is the one who hires E. Frederick Morrow, who had been working in the Commerce Department. Adams brings him into the executive White House staff. He is the first African American to work in such a position. Morrow's from New Jersey, and he had worked for the NAACP. He was a Bowdoin grad, and this gave him a spot in the Eisenhower administration where he could advocate for civil rights issues, or at least make the administration more aware than they were of some of the injustices going on. And indeed, since the Brown v. Board of Education court case happens during the Eisenhower administration, now, you can't say that Eisenhower made the Brown v. Board of Education decision happen. His attorney general did pursue the same government position that Truman's administration had, that the plaintiffs had merit. But nonetheless, what might have been a blind spot is that there was a huge groundswell of reaction in the South, and that black people were being targeted by sometimes very organized groups. So, for instance, the situation that Eisenhower will end up responding to in Little Rock doesn't come about just because a spontaneous group of people rose up and they're racist and they react to black students coming to Little Rock High. It's an organized Little Rock Citizens Council that is very politically involved, that includes school board members, that actually has support among some of the teachers, and is very organized in countermeasures to counteract what the NAACP is doing there. And not only that, they put pressure on the governor, Orville Faubus, to react in the situation. That's something that Morris is uniquely able to at least keep Eisenhower's Attorney General, Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Sherman Adams, and the Cabinet Secretary, who Morris would have been reporting to because the Eisenhower administration is very structured, all of them aware of what's actually going on. One of the things he writes in a memo to the Cabinet Secretary is, do you realize that there are Mississippians now who are forming underground groups because any one of them can be targeted by white mobs? Unfortunately, other influential voices in the Eisenhower administration, one of them noted in a book I recently read, is J. Edgar Hoover. is convincing them that black activists are a bunch of communists. And so you have this kind of paralyzing effect. And so we can't put Sherman Adams as necessarily like a super pro-civil rights figure. Nonetheless, I can't see any other way but that he pushed Eisenhower towards intervention, at least in the Little Rock matter, but only after exhausting every other option. Because if Sherman Adams wasn't for this, probably would have gotten blocked. But in the Little Rock matter, one thing that Sherman Adams does is try at first to negotiate with Governor Orville Faubus. And that's because he has a friend, Adams does, a good friend, the Congressman Brooks Hayes from the Little Rock area, who says, look, Faubus is apologetic here. Looks like he's done something wrong, and he doesn't want to go up against Eisenhower. So why don't you have a meeting? And while Adams suggests this to Eisenhower, Eisenhower accepts. It turns out that Hayes didn't get it right, that Faubus sort of uses the White House meeting. He's very silent during the meeting. He doesn't agree to anything. And then he goes out and resists the integration of the Little Rock school system, nonetheless. It'll actually turn out, incidentally, that Brooks Hayes, the congressman, just for this middling step, just for trying to work something out with the White House, when words gets around Little Rock about that, he's primaried. He wins the primary, but then there's a write-in campaign in the general election, and Brooks Hayes narrowly loses his congressional seat to a school board member from Little Rock. So even these moderate steps, so even the little things that in history looks like very little, what Eisenhower did on civil rights, he takes tremendous heat for, and so does the administration, and so did Congressman Hayes. Another issue where Adams is of great use is in dealing with Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, who's making wild claims at this point in the Eisenhower administration. The Eisenhower administration's getting kind of tired of him. Eisenhower's already sent Nixon out to make a statement countering McCarthy. And what they really don't like is when McCarthy starts attacking the Army. And one of the things that Sherman Adams is critical for discovering is that McCarthy and his lawyer Roy Cohn had been demanding things of the Army. And when they didn't get it, they have Cohn on record saying, "We'll wreck the Army." And in particular, it's an assistant of Roy Cohn, the lawyer for McCarthy, David Schein. And he, Cohn is on record telling the Army that they better give good treatment, meaning light assignments, light duty to Roy Cohn's assistant, who's been drafted in the Army, or else, so to speak. And the best way to see how Sherman Adams does his work is he brings in a bunch of friendly congressmen and says, "Newspapers have found out about it." Meaning, obviously, Sherman Adams told those newspapers. Newspapers have found out about it and are upset. Once this happens, and this story's released to the press, and congressmen get wind of it, McCarthy goes from being the senator kind of prosecuting communists to, in this matter, being the one on the stand having to answer questions. And that's when you get to that famous moment where McCarthy is challenged for going after the Army, and eventually McCarthy's going to be censured. Sherman Adams plays a key, if quiet, role in this story. In 1958, there's building resentment as you get into the second term, particularly about Sherman Adams. In fact, even though he saves Nixon's job twice, they don't always see eye to eye. And in 1958, Sherman Adams' career as this kind of a president's assistant comes to an end. He had helped out a Massachusetts mill owner a person with a lot of money, Bernard Goldfein, when he ran into a federal charge about improper labeling. Adams made a few phone calls. Okay. The press got wind of it. Okay. But it turns out Goldfein had paid for $3,000 of hotel bills and other gifts for Goldfein. Adams turned around and said, "They're friends. Look, I bought him a gold watch." And Ike actually comes out and defends Adams. And probably for the charges of the media and charges of the Democrats, that was probably enough. But it's when his rivals in the GOP party comes out, including major donors, saying he's finished and he needs to go. RNC head Meade Allern insisted that he go. Ike caved in to fire Adams, sent Nixon and Allern, and this was the hardest job, according to Nixon, that he ever had to do. He would say that in the David Frost interview after his presidency. That ability to be a lightning rod for presidents is actually pretty important in the story of some of the people that we're talking about today, and it's an undersold area of the presidency. You know, there's a famous story that reporter Hudson goes in to see Daniel Lamont, who's the secretary for Grover Cleveland, the president, and really wants to see him to talk about matters. And he makes a comment like, "Lamont was too busy, so I had to satisfy myself with talking to the President of the United States." And that's how important Daniel Lamont was. Lamont starts as secretary for Cleveland in the governor's office in New York, where he's known as the other governor. And that's where we get picked up on by William C. Hudson in his Recollections. I love this little book. On the night before his inauguration as governor, he was in possession of the executive mansion, Governor Cornell having courteously vacated it for him. The retiring governor called on the incoming governor to give him such assistance as he could. During the course of the evening, Governor Cornell asked the governor-elect as to the person that was to be his private secretary. "Oh," replied Cleveland, "I haven't appointed anyone yet." "That's a matter that can wait." "Ah," returned Cornell, "you are in the same position precisely that I was 3 years ago. You must appoint a private secretary. You must do it tonight or early tomorrow morning. Certain duties which must be discharged on the first day of your administration are devolved by law on your private secretary and can be performed by no one else." The new governor was incredulous, but the truth of Governor Cornell's position and the necessity for action were soon demonstrated. Cleveland says when he's elected, "Daniel, if you don't come and help me in the White House, I'm not going to take the job." This is what Medvedev says. Lamont's record in Washington shows that Cleveland was wise in insisting on his friend's continued service, the teamwork of the two men, their joint approach to every detail of executive business, and their seeming ability to read each other's minds deeply impressed contemporary observers. Early in the term, reporters dubbed Lamont the assistant president. By the end of Cleveland's first term, the New York Times was describing him as the most successful presidential aide since the days of Lincoln and Nicolay, and raving about Lamont's universal popularity. Champ Clark said of Lamont, "To one benediction from the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the peacemakers. In politics, that was his chief business, and certainly since that famous utterance, no man needed a peacemaker on his staff more than Mr. Cleveland. He had no equal in provoking men to wrath, and Lamont no rival in administering soothing syrup." Very angry Washington political goes into the White House office, and Lamont tilts back in his chair, looks at the visitor with his eyes, very smiling and attentive, and says not a word till the man is finished. He had an enormous mustache covering his mouth, leading some observers to believe you can't tell what this man's thinking of what you're saying. He's inscrutable. By the middle of Cleveland's first term, Lamont's characteristic silence became so well known that it served as a subject for an anonymous poet pretending to be Cleveland's voice in a Republican campaign pamphlet. And this explains why we never want to trust to any save our friend Lamont. Dan knows our inner life and so discreet is he the world imagines us a Cato, or Sodus, unchaste life would prove a treat to scandalmongers seeking toothsome data. But all who try to pump good old Daniel meet the silence of a most discreet potato. They said like Sodus, unchaste life, and what he said about Grover Cleveland, but yeah, I think he would, be one to have a drink or two or three or four at the White House after the work is done, or in the middle of work, because both Lamont and Cleveland would be sitting there working on paperwork until 2 a.m. He's ferocious with his work habits. William C. Hudson, he became a heaven-born secretary. He was equipped with the sort of knowledge so necessary to the governor, and had a wide acquaintance with the men and things of New York State. Also, he was shrewd, secretive, loyal to the interest he espoused, and possessed infinite tact. Lamont became indispensable to Cleveland. The governor was not an easy man to handle. When he arrived at a conclusion, he was most difficult to move. Opposition was of little use. It seemed to confirm him more in his course. He was not a good judge of men, and was apt to select the wrong people. Lamont soon learned that the wrong way to deal with him was to combat him. On one occasion, Grover Cleveland said to me, William Hudson says, "Lamont's a wonderful man. I never saw his like. He has no friends to gratify or reward, and no enemies to punish." To those who were admitted into the intimacy of the executive chamber, Lamont's methods were a source of much amusement. Here's an instance. There's a vacancy in the office of State Superintendent of Salt Springs in Syracuse. There were several aspirants. Delegations were journeying to the capital in support of one or the other. Then there came a delegation on behalf of a man who was not of either party. The spokesman was a man of pleasant appearance, engaging manners, and fluent speech. Nevertheless, he was an undesirable citizen, unreliable in his habits and practice, not guided by the rules of morality. This is Hudson writing. Cleveland, knowing nothing as to his reputation, took an enormous fancy to him, preferring him to the man whose claims the delegation had advocated, and after the delegation had gone, made it clear to Lamont that he had made his choice for the place. Lamont became alarmed. He realized it would be a blunder of great dimensions. To combat the idea would be to confirm the governor in his intention that this would be the right person. Instead, Lamont sought the aid of the lieutenant governor. The aid came in the presence of Mr. Hill in the executive chamber that afternoon, after the doors are closed to the public. This little drama was enacted, and here William C. Hudson in his book writes it as a little play, How to Dispose of an Undesirable by Daniel Scott Lamont. Cast: the governor of the state, Grover Cleveland; the lieutenant governor, David Hill; the private secretary, Daniel Lamont; and the audience, myself. Scene: executive chamber in the capital of the state. Discovered: the governor of the state busily engaged at his desk, facing the south. His private secretary busily engaged at the desk, in the immediate rear, facing the north. Enter the lieutenant governor, and crossing the executive desks. Lieutenant Governor Hill: Good afternoon, Governor. Public business seems to weigh heavily on you today. Grover Cleveland: Yes, quite busy. Since you are here, the Senate is not in session? Lieutenant Governor Hill: No, adjourned until tomorrow. To the private secretary: Good afternoon, Dan. I see your old friend so-and-so from Syracuse was here today. Lamont: Yes, he was here. Lieutenant Governor Hill: Was he sober? Cleveland suspends work and partly turns to listen. Seemed to be, Lamont said. How did he get here? Hill says. Like the rest, Lamont says. I suppose by the cars. But to ride on the cars requires money. Who'd he borrow it from? I don't know. Some stranger to Syracuse, I suppose. Did he go away sober? Lamont: I don't know. I didn't see him after he left here. How will he get back? Didn't he borrow money from you, did he? Lamont: Oh, no, I kept out of his way. Cleveland turns to his desk with a grumble. An entirely different man was finally appointed, William C. Hudson notes after this drama. Lamont rarely attempted to bring up his personal influence to bear on the governor when he thought Mr. Cleveland should be dissuaded from any purpose. but it was his practice to select for the effort some person who he thought was in the governor's good books. Once Cleveland suspected that politics was on the bottom of any matter, he went the other way. But this is the way that Lamont operated, and he would go on to that purpose in the White House.
The investigation of the Democratic break-in thing, we're back in the problem area because the FBI is not under control because Gray doesn't exactly know how to control it.
A figure that we're probably closer to knowing in time maybe is Bob Haldeman, who is Nixon's assistant.
Their investigation is now leading in some productive areas because they've been able to trace the money, not through the money itself, but through the bank sources, the banker stuff, and it goes.
And who many people called the assistant president. Famously, he did not agree with this. Nixon even joked that he was the executioner in chief because all the bad stuff would be done by Haldeman. From 1969 to 1973, he became one of the most well-known, partially because he was fired due to obstruction of justice during the Watergate. He discovers Haldeman during his 1960 presidential campaign when he was an advance man. He was impressed by him and brought him into the fold during his 1968 run. He considered that there had been mistakes made in 1960 and then in the run in 1962, and he wanted things to be extremely efficient, and Haldeman sets this system up. John Dean, who became the counsel, also infamous for Watergate, talks about this memo system they had. This is all before computers, where, you had a certain amount of time. If a memo came from Haldeman and you were working in that White House, even somebody who considered themselves like a big expert, like the White House counsel, I don't have to cower to this chief of staff guy, You had a limited amount of time. It might be like, you need to answer this request by tomorrow at noon. And you had to have some kind of response. And if he just ghosted it, that wasn't going to fly. And so he'd get several John Dean if he didn't respond to, say, a memo. And sometimes it was crazy stuff that Dean didn't want to do, something that the president thought of, and it would be illegal or not advisable. And he would just ignore it. They would get, he would get phone calls from secretary, a phone call from another secretary. And then finally, Bob would call up and say, really, Dean, what do you think? You're better than the rest of us? We all have to respond to these things. So there was this system of memos that was pretty intense, set up by Haldeman so that everything would get resolved and Nixon would get his answers. Medvedev tells the story of a disastrous airport rally during the campaign of '68. Exhausted candidate steps out of his plane at Cleveland, sees a sparse crowd, no signs, no cheering. PA doesn't work. Traveling press is hungry for some novelty report, starts talking about how little turnout in Ohio occurred. As the campaign took off for the next stop, Nixon struggled to control his temper. Finally, as Haldeman sat down beside him, Nixon broke his silence and barks out, "There will be no more landings at airports." Haldeman dutifully transcribed the order on his yellow legal pad, then began to consider the consequences. If he would permit no further landings at airport, where would he land? In cornfields? In parking lots? Would he parachute into waiting crowds? Haldeman drew a thick line through what he had written. Obviously, what Nixon had meant was, there'll be no more rallies at airports. But this command also made no sense. For months, the technique of airport rallies had been used with telling effect. TV newsmen depended on the action film to use in their evening broadcasts. That would be a major mistake. Haldeman knew that when Nixon regained his composure, he would regret the impetuous decree. Therefore, the presidential edict, as it was finally filtered down, proclaimed there would be no more unsuccessful rallies at airports. This is the kind of power that Haldeman had and brought to the White House after the win. Here's an example. It got more sinister, as we know, and this is an example. He knew that some of Nixon's crude ideas for wreaking vengeance on his enemies would surely lead to trouble. But in other instances, when he felt certain presidential abuses would remain undetected by the public, he cheerfully participated in the questionable activities. Thought nothing, for example, of ordering a FBI investigation of the harmless comic Richard M. Dixon, who capitalized on his striking physical resemblance to the president. Well, he balked at the idea of denying White House access to hostile correspondent Mike Wallace. In the latter case, a major uproar would surely ensue. But in the former, Nixon's urges could be indulged with little danger of bad publicity. He gave in to Nixon's petty obsessions at least as often as he resisted them. Nevertheless, he always argued it would be worse if he wasn't there. He recommended Nixon wear blue suits. They look good on television. He would set up and select little props like the bust of Lincoln, American flag lapel pin, colorful charts and maps that would be behind Nixon when he was speaking, and be sure that everything ran smoothly. He planned everything on Nixon's trip to China. From the moment the president stepped off the plane in Peking, calculated to coincide with television prime time, he orchestrated every minute. The China trip was Bob's masterpiece, his Sistine Chapel. Unlike previous chiefs of staff, Haldeman centralized power, making the White House staff a direct extension of Nixon's will. This controlled and allowed Nixon to focus on broader strategic goals, while Haldeman managed day-to-day operations. But it also contributes to the secrecy and paranoia that characterized Nixon's presidency.
The FBI guys working the case had concluded that there were one or two possibilities. One, that this was a White House.
Haldeman's role in Watergate, particularly the cover-up efforts, led to his resignation.
They don't think there's anything about the election committee. They think it was either a White House operation that had some obscure reasons for it.
And later conviction for conspiracy and obstruction of justice.
Non-political. Or was the Cubans and the CIA.
I've had a chance to go through the file that I had on Jack Connor. It is in excellent shape. He had,
when you mention people that might be considered Washington hands or great people who assisted presidents but did so more quietly in the background, there's no way you can talk about that subject without talking about Clifford. And it's kind of interesting because I was asked recently by a listener, how did Clark get to a position where he was so influential?
I have a copy of that trust instrument, and I also have a copy of the letter which he wrote to Senator Magnuson, the chairman of the Commerce Committee, which could serve as a good model for your friend to use.
And what I discovered doing more research on it, it's a combo of things. One is he was kind of in the right place at the right time. The other is he was uniquely gifted. He had a really sharp mind. He was intensely productive in a time when you're talking about the post-World War II era. And everything is bureaucracy, and there's a lot of lawyerly work to go through. He could do so crisply and quickly and help others do their job. So he's a naval legal aid, and he comes to Washington on what's supposed to be just a few weeks stint. And essentially, he'll never leave. It also helps, he happens to be from Missouri, and this is now the Truman administration. But the first thing Clifford does is he sees the general counsel in the White House, sees how overworked he is, and he just goes over and volunteers I have my naval duties, but I see, sir, that you have a lot of work. Can I help out? And just starts moving the piles for this guy, and he's now got a friend, and the general counsel recommends him directly to the president. He starts working with the president. It helped that I came from Missouri, he said. It also helps that some of the Missouri hands that Truman brings with him, some of the people from his own Senate office, are just frankly not really that good, not as productive. He gets to know what Truman wants. He doesn't like Eastern elitism. He's better and brighter than the other aides. And here's something else. Clifford starts getting a lot of press. So the answer to the question of how Clifford becomes so important is some things like right place, right time, talent, but also it's a lot of press spin involved as well, making that even larger than maybe to what he was contributing. In fact, there's so many news stories about it, about Clifford in the Truman White House, that two things happen. One, the press secretary, the White House press secretary, it's like, I'm answering questions all the time about Cliff. He's young at this time, handsome guy, whatever. They like writing stories about him. There's also a cartoon that shows Truman as the dummy and Clifford as the ventriloquist. And that was a meme that was out there at the time. And in fact, Clifford's so worried about this, he starts telling reporters, please don't do this kind of thing. And he apologizes to the president about the cartoon. And of course, Truman says, there's nothing you can do about that, you know. There's really a bond between these two. I should get into a bit of two things that he does, crucial in writing the National Security Act. And people see that and take note. And that's important for two reasons. One, it's a really important piece of legislation that is going to be used. It's a really important piece of legislation, but you also have to remember, if you're the person that wrote this all-important act for the reorganization of the government, we're now going to have a Department of Defense. We're not going to have a Department of War anymore, but we're going to keep a Defense Department going. You're going to have the inside scoop, having written the law, in helping people later on. The second thing he does is help manage Truman's 1948 campaign. So now you can see, and of course Truman is successful, and it's a surprise. You know, in modern politics that any of these like consultants or aides that are associated with an election win, particularly a surprise one, you know, you hear about like Karl Rove or Steve Bannon or Jim Carville or things like that, you know, they get extra credibility and fame. And so he almost has a twosie there. He's got electoral capabilities and inside, you know, capabilities and stuff like that. I'm almost thinking with Clark Clifford, like think about George Stephanopoulos, who said, you know, I was great on the campaign and I was great dealing with the press. Once he gets into the White House, he's not really able to help Clinton that much and maybe even becomes a little bit of a liability, doesn't deal with Washington well. Clifford has both of those skills. This is what Medvedev writes, who interviewed Clark Clifford for his book in 1973. Clark Clifford speaks with an authority about discussing Truman's political strategy. He devised the strategy a year before the election. In an astonishing memorandum, he explained to the president he could restore his popularity and score a great political upset. A president who is a candidate must resort to subterfuge. He cannot sit silent. He must be in the limelight. The special counsel recommended an all-out attack on the Republican-controlled 80th Congress. The high cost of living would be the most controversial issue of the 1948 campaign. Indeed, the only issue. The administration's recommendations in the State of Union message and elsewhere must be tailored to the voter, not the congressman. They must display a label that reads, "No compromises." He also advised that Truman take a stand on civil rights. It would appear to be sound strategy to have the president go as far as he possibly could to protect the rights of minority groups. In crisis, Americans tend to back up the president. So the battle with the Kremlin is a substantial plus. During the president's whistle-stop tours, Clifford rode along with the train, scribbling out new material for Truman to fire at his audiences. As they pulled into backwater stations, Clifford and his colleagues used to jump out of the train, dissolve into crowds, and applaud energetically at speeches they themselves had written. They asked him, hey, why don't you run for Senate from Missouri? You'd be great. Nah, not interested. I'm interested in government, not in politics.
They learned that the chairman must be a Washington man. When Killian was chairman, it really didn't work very well because he lived in Boston. Second, also helps a lot if the chairman has a personal relationship with the president.
Sure.
It'll be helpful to you because it keeps him up with every development in the intelligence field, which also keeps him very well informed.
People are awed by this. But he also takes on huge corporate clients. And during the Eisenhower years, when Democrats aren't in power, Clifford was always a loyal Democrat. He's making $500,000 to $1 million a year, good money in that time. He's all the top companies as clients. When Kennedy comes into office, he's back. And here again, you got to remember now, Democrats have been out of power for 8 years. And Kennedy welcomes having this guy. Now, there was some initial friction because he had backed Stuart Symington and not Kennedy for the nomination in 1960. But JFK does find him extremely useful and uses him for the transition between Kennedy and Eisenhower. He helps Kennedy overcome a major presidential crisis, in this case with the steel companies. He also serves on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. Clifford does two things that people love. One is that everything's secret. When he discusses something with a president, it's not going to get out there in the Washington gossip. The other thing is he's very frank. He's very realistic. And during the Cold War, he has a very, grim view of the world. You might consider him a hawk. Presidents welcome his advice. When Kennedy's assassinated, JFK already knows Clifford from playing poker with Truman and at the poker games. And LBJ is a big Clifford fan because Clifford's a hawk. He kind of matches LBJ on his opinion of the Vietnam War.
Let me ask you this. Do you observe the testedness that I observe not only in Bob but in Buzz? I observe it in Bob, and I spent an hour with him yesterday morning. He's harassed, disturbed, and worried, and I had a little different impression. I had just a little feeling almost of pity for him yesterday. He's gotten himself so wound up ideologically. But he's still willing to do what you want him to do, and his loyalty is still there. Now, Buzz, I think, has really been under a lot of pressure lately. I think he gets it from the Joint Chiefs from one standpoint, he gets it from Westy from another, and then he gets it from Bob from another. And I think he's just buffeted and pushed around back and forth and pummeled until he speaks up maybe a little more, with a little more asperity than he thinks. I understand it, I sympathize with him, and as the meetings go on, I think I've developed a good deal of basic confidence in the fellow, so that if he can be permitted to emerge from this present posture he's in, I think he can be enormously useful. It's just now that it's like a horse that is constantly under a rein 1 hour and the lash the next hour, and it's a little hard for him to function.
Well, he is deteriorating very rapidly with me the last week, more so than all the 4 years I've been president. And he's not going to be much value to me if he goes another week like he has the last one, because I'm losing confidence in what he says and the way he thinks, and he looks like to me he stumbles, and he's thick, and he's heavy, and he's heavy.
After McNamara resigns, Clark Clifford takes over as LBJ's Secretary of Defense. Now, this is his first actual cabinet position. Humphrey said in his memoirs that he would have made Clark Clifford his Secretary of State. And so, his law firm is overlooking the White House. He has a lot of clients. So he has this mixture of both in the private sector and the public sector, all of this clout. And certainly for Democrats, he's someone who can have the big meetings. During the Carter administration, because Jimmy Carter's a bit of an outsider and Clifford would be a bit different from that, he's not going to get the same level of respect, but he's still influential. And, he'll come in for certain meetings. He will be involved in meetings around the Iran hostage crisis. Where Clifford has his fall from grace is actually in the 1980s. He's associated with a bank, BCCI, that buys a smaller bank, which Clifford is counsel for, has shares in. And it's a fraud. I mean, they're using bank shares of the main company to buy shares in the smaller bank, which is illegal, as a loan, to secure a loan, which is like self-trading and this other fraud that goes on. Obviously, they're not telling investigators. They're not telling investors. All sorts of problems with loans that are issued by this bank. and it gets caught up in that savings and loan scandal. And, so after 87 or so, Clifford's reputation certainly suffers. A guy who had been big since the Truman administration, suffers. Here's what Michael Medved said. A visit to Clifford's office brings with it the sense of pilgrimage to a national shrine. The physical surroundings are modest enough, courtly, old-fashioned furnishings, suggesting the comfortable air of an English country inn. Nor are the walls covered with autographed pictures and other mementos that decorate the offices of most other men who've served their time in the White House. It is Clifford himself who is the monument, as he tilts back in his antique desk, spinning out lucid sentences as impatient Missouri drawl, describing decisions that changed the face of the world. And we talked about Clifford he's not there to kowtow to people. He's worked for enough presidents, and he has his own kind of independent reputation. So shortly after Clifford becomes Department of Defense, Johnson asked him to provide 200,000 troops to reinforce the 500,000 already there. He wasn't the sort of man to follow orders just blindly. Here's what David Halberstam writes. He had a great sense of his own value and did not believe that anyone hired Clark Clifford, except to gain the full benefit of Clark Clifford's services. A great lawyer is paid for telling a rich and powerful client the truth, no matter how unpalatable. It also helps to be rich and also have a nice book of clients, so getting fired is not a problem. So to find out the truth whether this would help, Clifford commenced an in-depth investigation, realizing that neither 200,000 nor even 400 men could permanently secure objectives. He now reverses his hawkish positions, and becomes convinced that sanity demanded an end to the policy of escalation. Time to begin serious negotiations. He was alone among the president's advisors in pushing this point of view. No one else could in that White House. And Johnson didn't forgive him for it. But he did force Johnson to look at this policy and change. Harry Hopkins was one of the most influential figures of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, a man so trusted by FDR that he lives in the White House for 3.5 years in the White House. It begins on May 10, 1940, when Germany launches its invasion of the Netherlands. After an exhausting day of strategizing, Roosevelt says, "Harry, just stay here in the second-floor bedroom." And he would just continue to stay. His path to the trusted position begins in an odd place because he doesn't really know Roosevelt that well until he's elected president. You see a couple of these cases. In 1922, he manages the Belleville-Yorkville Health Project, and he becomes an executive director of the New York Tuberculosis Association. So he's getting his experience as an administrator, and a gifted one, of charity work. In 1931, Governor Roosevelt appoints him to the TERA, the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, after the Great Depression hits, and Roosevelt's in charge of New York State's effort. He's seeing what he's doing, but I wouldn't describe these two as close. Nonetheless, he becomes head of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. Also, the Civil Works, the CWA, and eventually the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, the one that's better known today. It's huge, and it employs 8.5 million people constructing roads. The famous thing is that Harry Hopkins takes over this building, apparently has his foot up on the desk and just starts directing things before there's even furniture in the FERA building. And famously or infamously spends $5 million in one day. But when World War II erupts, he becomes FDR's major envoy, key architect. He's going over to Britain to assess the country's resolve, to talk to Churchill, to give Churchill a sense that a very important person close to Franklin Roosevelt has been sent to him. He makes a statement authorized by FDR that says, "Whither thou goest, I will go in London. That sends a signal to the British that this friend of FDR has been told to deliver this message. He's instrumental in managing Lend-Lease. It's a $50 billion program. And he helps to shape the conferences at Tehran and Yalta, all while he's battling stomach cancer. It's a classic moment when Wendell Willkie, who's FDR's opponent in 1940, attacks Hopkins and says that he's a close advisor and he's acting like a president. He's making the decisions. He lives in the White House. He has undue influence. Roosevelt responds in a campaign speech stating, "Well, here's what I think of Harry Hopkins. We had a man who worked for $1 a year in Washington who, with the enemy at our gate, kept this country going. He sleeps in a little room upstairs in the White House, so he can be near to serve me. When he got sick and the doctors ordered to give up and leave, he stayed at his post of duty until I practically ordered him out of Washington to go and rest. And then he came back." And so you see occasionally these defenses of the aides by presidents. I see it again and again in reviewing the history of presidents and their aides. So he has to do that a couple of times with Harry Hopkins. One is a more private moment. So after the election's over and FDR defeats Wendell Willkie, still talk about Willkie running again, but he's offering FDR his help now in the Lend-Lease program. And FDR's like, "Why don't you talk to Harry?" And he says, "I don't want to talk to Harry Hopkins. I don't want to talk to that man." And because he had such a bad image. And FDR says, "You know, Wendell, one day you may get to this office. And I'll tell you this. You're going to find that a man who's here to simply serve your interests is something you're really going to need." I hope you enjoyed hearing about some of the presidents and their unique people that they might bring in to assist them. So that concept in and of itself is certainly not novel. Having said that, presidents are often judged and in many cases that we've gone over throughout time criticized by who they pick and what they do. Sometimes they'll use them as foils, lightning rods for criticism. And the aides will either accept that or be very bitter about it. A lot of different people, a lot of different stories. I want to thank you for listening. If you want more information on this, The Shadow Presidents, Michael Medved, he's now a radio show host, but he wrote this book back in 1973. Pretty good one if you can find it. I want to thank you for listening. Website is www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. We've got that. Patreon, if you can help out. Really appreciate it.